Hello, and welcome to part 3 of the Intro to 3D Coat series. In this video, we're going to take a look at the paint room. So in order to start working in the paint room, we'll go ahead and choose the Paint UV Map Mesh workflow. This window will show you a set of preset models that you can choose from, or you can browse to your own model. But for this demonstration, we'll go ahead and just choose this symbol. Okay, and I think what I'm going to do is reset this page back to default, as you may not have this layout. So let me go ahead and set this back to default by going to the Windows section up at the top and choose Reset this page to default. This might be what you see if you were to start 3D Coat and jump into the paint room. But I'm going to show you how to customize it, and I'm going to set it up to what I had in the beginning or something similar to. And the way you would do that is you would go to the Windows section again, and under Panels, you'll see all the options, all the panels that you can pull from that 3D Coat already offers. I know I'm going to want my alpha brushes, so I'll click that, and you'll see that it comes in as a floating window. So I'll just go ahead and start bringing some of the windows that I'm interested in, or panels that I'm interested in. Let's bring in the brush options panel. And I'm going to also want to bring in my color palette. Actually, the tool options are not going to pop up unless I select the tool that has that option. So for example, I know the fill tool has it. So if I click it, by default, it pops up into this corner, which I think is perfectly fine. But I grab this window and then I'll just go ahead and dock it somewhere for myself, for my preference. But you can certainly just leave it here. When you have something that doesn't have that option, it just goes away, so it doesn't take any space. And you can always close these windows by clicking on the X in the top corner of the panel. Okay, so let's go ahead and start setting up my preset. So I'll grab my brushes, and I like to dock my brushes all the way to the left. So you see that purple highlight box, that just means that that's where that's going to dock. If I move this to the top up here, it's going to want to squeeze in this area as well. So you can move it around anywhere in the window that you feel that you would like it to be. If you set it to the side like this, it will turn into a tab within that panel. Okay, so let's go ahead and start setting this up. I'm going to move it all the way to the side, and now it's become one panel that's off to the side. I can take my brush options and I can drag it down to the lower section, and now it's split that panel into two. So now I have a brush options as well as my brushes up top. I'll take the color palette and I'll just go ahead and put that as a tab next to my texture editor. And now I can switch between those two. The paint object is the outliner equivalent inside of 3D Coat. So this is where your objects will show. So if you have many objects that compose an asset, you'll see all the objects listed in this panel. For this, I like to dock that along the side, only because if I bring in a set or a complex object, I may have a longer list of meshes, and that way I don't have to keep switching back and forth and then dragging the slider up and down to find what I'm looking for. Now that I have this to the side, I like to grab my tool options and set that just above. So my tool options will sit right up here, and my list of meshes will show under the Paint Objects panel. And the one other thing I'd like to bring in are my stencils. So I'll go to the Stencils panel. And these are my stencils, and I'm going to dock that as a tab next to the brushes. So now I can switch between stencils and brushes. One other thing that we'll need to bring in are our smart materials. So we'll go back to Windows, Panel, and find smart materials and bring those in. And with my smart materials, I just like to dock that down below, like so. And if you find these icons to be too big or too small, you can always change the size from tiny to huge. But for me, I like to leave it under normal so I can get more in a smaller space. And you can see when I dock it down below, it lists my categories of my smart materials in these tabs, so I can switch between different types of smart materials. And I make my own as well, so I can keep increasing this library. But we'll just go back to default for now. And this is true for the alphas as well. Right now, we're looking at the default panel. But if you click in this panel, you'll see all these other folders that have materials as well. So I can click under my 3D coat brushes. And this may take a second because there's so many. And you can click anywhere in here and you can drag the window up and down. You can even kind of push it and it has a glide, so you can just let it kind of glide to the top or bottom, or you can just click and move it with your mouse. These also have the option to show the alpha at any size, so you can show at a tiny size so you can get more in the screen. I find that to be a little bit more difficult, but I guess it depends on the size monitor you're working with. Or you can show it a little larger to give you a better indication of what those alphas look like. I'm fine with normal. Seems to be fine for me. And there we go. Okay, and so one other thing you want to take a look at before you even get started are your preferences. So you'll find preferences under Edit, Preferences. It's always good to take a look, especially when you first install the program. Make sure everything is as you'd like it to be. So for example, you can opt into, when 3D Coat saves, you can opt to have it zip the save file just to compress it and save a little bit of disk space. I typically don't do that, but you have that option. And then you have this autosave time. Now it'll autosave at 10-minute increments, and you can set up what the depth of your saves are. And that means like how many versions do you want to save? I typically leave it at 2, but I believe the default is 4. Okay, so we can go to the next tab. And here, 3D Coat has a connection with Quixel Megascan. You have this option to bring in Megascan's materials and objects, and let me show you what that looks like. So let's cancel out of this for a moment. If you go under File, and here you have Install, you can install Quixel assets as smart materials, as shaders, or as vertex shaders, or vertex textures. So let's go back into the preferences. So here, this is where you're going to define where your folder lives for those assets. Also, if you have Photoshop, or maybe you're using another 2D application like Krita or Corel, or your 2D application of choice, you can set up a path that goes to that application, which just means that if you're working in 3D Coat in the paint room, you may want to send your textures out to your 2D package to further author them and then bring them back in. So it gives you a bridge between your 2D painting package and your 3D Coat as well. Okay, let's move on to the viewport. in the Viewport tab, you have the option to work in Z up coordinate system or Y up coordinate system. By default, it's Y up. You may be working in a software package or a 3D package like 3D Studio Max, and that may be set up to Z up coordinate system. Well, you can always enable the Z up coordinate system to match that application. So when you are bridging between those two, you're making sure that your coordinate space is synced up. You also have the option for your background to display a spherical map or an HDR map as the background image. And you can define the map here, and you can choose to use the environment map as your background. Also, 3D Coat offers a 3D printing workflow. So you can define the size of your 3D printing bed over in this section of the preferences. And then that way, when you're printing, it's going to give you a visual representation of the bed, so you can make sure your placement and size all fits within the constraints of your 3D printer. And there's some more options for your brush type or your brushing section. And one of the things that I really enjoy is that they've added a 3D mouse function, and they've had this for a few years now. I recently had purchased a space mouse by 3D Connection, and it's a game changer. I love it, and 3D Coat really works well with the space mouse. And in my demo of this, I will be using a space mouse myself along with a Wacom tablet. You can change the theme for 3D Coat to pretty much anything you like based on what colors are being displayed, whether they're in the panels or your font colors or whatever it is. They've really given you a lot of freedom to make the change to work the way you'd like. And you can always save these themes off, so you can jump between these different themes as you're working. If you find that the font size is too large or too small, they've given this option to change the font size for your UI. So for example, if I set this to medium and hit apply, I find that it's a little bit too big for me. I'm working with a 27-inch monitor, so I don't need these really big fonts. I like to set it to small and apply, and then now for me this works best, and it gives me the real estate that I'm after. You can see there's a ton of control here. There's also this Tools tab. So these are options that the 3D Coat guys offer, and you can enable and disable any of these as you like. Some of these come in defaulted on when you install 3D Coat, but you can also uncheck them and set it the way you like. There's also a tab for beta. The guys that are building 3D Coat are pretty amazing how frequently they're updating this application. And they do put in some new features here and there that you can try out. They let you know that they're beta. So if there's any problems with that, you can always report it on the website. But if you want to take a look at some of the new features, you can feel free to enable them and try them out and give your feedback. So let's get out of the preferences. So what is the paint room exactly? How do you work in the paint room? So this video is not going to be about making beautiful work, but it's going to be more about showing you how you use the tools within 3D Coat, and so you have a good idea of what to expect as you start jumping around. So the first thing we'll do is pick an alpha brush just to show how the paintbrush works. So I'll take this first one, and you can see right away that the brush comes on when I'm over the object, and it goes away when I'm off the object. If I'm away from the object in the background space, I can move around the object, I can tumble, I can zoom in and out. That's all in this empty space. But once the mouse goes over the object, it's expecting you to do some kind of editing to that object itself. And you can see as I'm brushing, or not brushing, but as I'm moving the brush, you can see that it's actually moving with the normals of the surface. which gives you a really nice indication of where and how it's going to apply that brush stroke. Before I start brushing, I'm going to disable some of these filters. So I'm going to disable my depth and I'm going to disable my glossiness, and I'm only going to paint with the color right now. So this brush is just a smooth brush, and the red line that you're seeing on here is kind of indicating like the curve of this brush. So you know that it's going to be heaviest in the center and it's going to taper and fade off as it goes out to the edges. And you can see that behavior here. So it gets soft around the edges and it's opaque towards the center. To change the size of the brush, you can, while you're over the model, you can right click your mouse or your pen and move it left or right to change the size, or move it up and down to change the depth contribution. Right now I have the depth filter disabled, so whether I have the depth really high or whether I have the depth completely flat, it's going to be the same because it's being ignored. To erase anything that you may have painted, you can go to the eraser tab or the eraser tool, and you can erase with an alpha, or you can use the same alpha that you've originally worked with, or choose a different alpha. So maybe we'll choose something like this, and then I can start erasing with an alpha. So I can create more of a wear breakup with a different brush. So something you may have noticed is if I'm moving my mouse and I'm clicking, you can see this white line that's trailing. If you're wondering what that is, 3D Coat gives you this option of having a lazy mouse. It's called steady stroke, and you can see that this option is enabled. If I disable it, it won't have that, and that just means that it's completely instant, which is useful. You don't always want it on, especially if you're going to be stamping and doing like little things like that. I like it. I think it's a good setting by default with a 14 pixel leader, but you can increase this to larger numbers. And then if you were to paint, let me grab a brush here and we'll go to the paintbrush. As I'm moving, let me make the brush smaller. As I'm moving, you can see how steady that stroke is. If I were to disable it and do the same thing, it might not be quite as smooth around the edges. And if I were to make really quick movements, I'll get this very much like a brush stroke. But if I enable steady stroke, this is where you don't want to use it, because you'll get a big lag between your strokes, because by the time you're here and you want to go back, you're not making the movements you're expecting. So just know that when you're working with the steady stroke, I think 14 is a really good number. You can always just type that number in. And I think it even works when you're brushing this way. It just takes the edge of the high frequency noise off of it. If you hold Control down, it's the invert. So by default, when I'm working with color, when I push down, I'm laying color down. But if I hold Control, it's the invert of that. So it's basically removing the color. So it's like an eraser. So I may paint a little, maybe erase a little, and so on. You can always enable the invert tool to be the standard behavior for any particular alpha by just clicking the invert tool, and now when I paint, it's going to do the invert. And if I hold Control, and now I'm actually painting. So it's just a behavior. This is super useful if you're painting, if you're creating your own brush type. Like if you're using ZBrush, for example, you might use the dam standard, which by default is creating a crease, and that crease is pushing into the surface, where you can create brushes like that as presets. You can change the radius of your brush through dynamically in the viewport, like we're doing here. You can also change it to a defined value by just moving your cursor left and right over the word radius. And you'll see that if I change that radius, something tiny, then my brush radius becomes small. I can type in a number and I can go above 1. I can say, give me a radius of 10. So now when I move it over, you see that it's huge. As I'm changing the radius here in the viewport, if you take a look at the number, they're linked together. So you get an idea of what that radius is. What the fall off is doing, so let's grab a brush. Alpha, actually, let me switch to the default brushes and grab this pattern. And I'll make this bigger. So now when you're looking at this pattern, you can see that the pattern is visible all the way around. Like each tile in this pattern has not faded, but it's solid. If I were to go to the fall off and I increase that value, let's say I take it up to 70 or 75 or whatever. So if I move the brush over the surface now, you can see that the alpha has a faded fall off in the transparency, and that is because it's based on this fall off here. So if I increase that even higher, like 95%, it's really all in the center. So if I stamp it, it might look like this. If I remove the fall off altogether and I stamp it, you'll get the solid alpha. So there's some of that control up here as well. And now let's take a look at these filters. So right now I'm only viewing color that's coming through the brush. But if I turn color off in brush, you'll see that there's no effect at all. And if I enable depth, and depth is going to be based on this percentage. And you can see that percentage in that red line in the middle of this circle. That's indicating how deep or what the depth intensity is. So if I right click and I bring it down, now when I print, you can see that I have some raised sections and it follows the amount that I've got on that red line. If I were to increase that or even decrease that further and do it, you'll see that it's a much shallower depth. Now I'm doing this all in the normal map. So if I were to look at it from the side, it's really not there. But visually, it does look like there's some depth. But if I were to switch this to the paint room for micro vertex, you'll get real displacement. Okay, so now that we know how the brush alphas work and how these filters work, let's try to turn off our depth and only enable our glossiness. Now the glossiness is going to be reflected based on what this value is under the roughness section. So here roughness is 0, which means that it should be very shiny. And if I start to paint, you can see that I'm painting a coat of clear reflective surface. If I hold Control down, I can erase that surface as well. So let's go ahead and add that surface. In fact, I'm going to clear everything that I've got here at the moment. So I can do that by using the Fill tool. And then in the options, Fill with Eraser. And I'll enable all my filters. So I'm going to erase the entire thing. And I'm going to fill with eraser on this entire layer. So I'll just hit layer, say yes, and now I've erased everything here. Let's go back to the brush tool. And let's apply that glossiness again. So we'll enable glossiness. We'll use this regular alpha, and let's just paint our glossiness. Okay, so we're painting with a roughness of 0. At any time, I can raise this value. Maybe I want to bring it up to 50, right? Now, if I paint over this, I've changed it to a roughness of 50, and you can see that it still has a sheen, but it's not completely reflective. Let's reduce this to maybe something around 25%, and I'll paint over this section. Again, now you're starting to see more of like a greasy reflection because we're adding a little bit of roughness to this clear coat. Okay. And you can also add metalness to whatever you're painting. So for example, I'll leave my roughness to be a little bit, a little blurred. I'll add metalness to it and paint on top. And you'll see now I've got a blurry metallic surface or a greasy reflection on a metallic surface. If I take the roughness all the way to 0, I'm going to have a chrome ball. Okay, and now let's just apply this in all the channels. So now I want to paint with depth, color, and the glossiness, or in this case, metallic. Let's grab a brush alpha. We'll grab something like this. Move over to here, and I'll add a little bit of depth. And now you can see that what I just painted with this alpha has a metallic effect. Let's try something different. Just stamp some of these, and you can get that sense of metallic. Okay, so let's set that back. All right, so we took a look at some of these features up on top and how you use them. Now let's go into a little bit more depth of the brushes. Let's clear what I have here again. So we'll go to our fill tool with the eraser, and we'll clear this level or this layer. We'll clear this layer. And let's grab brush like this. And by default, if I were to paint, I'm going to reduce the depth. If I were to paint, it's going to, oops, brush. If I were to paint, it's going to streak that brush across. Maybe we want to have a behavior on this brush so it's not just streaking the brush. We can go into the brush options of this alpha, and we can start to play around with a little bit of some jitter control. So for example, we can take the rotation, and we can have a random rotation between 0 to 90 or 0 to 360. We're just going to bump it a little bit. Maybe we'll do something like closer to 180. Okay, and then we can change the variation of the size of that, the radius of that brush as well. So we'll just say, let's just do 18.5% or 20% or whatever. Some depth variation as well. And we'll jitter some opacity. And we can even jitter position. So this should make it pretty chaotic. So if I were to brush now, you're going to get something like that. We can change the spacing of the brush. So right now it's not completely solid, but it's like 14% between each point. If I increase this, maybe let's bring it up to something like 39, it's going to space it further apart, as you can see. And if I increase it over 100, then I should see a bigger change. We can also change things like, do we want the brush to follow the stroke? So why don't we grab something like this square? And right now, I'm going to go ahead and remove all the jitters and all this stuff that we've added. So, oh, actually, because I chose a different alpha, it doesn't have any settings. If I go back to that alpha that we just set up, all the settings are stored with that alpha. So now let's go to this square and let's just go ahead and erase this layer, fill. Okay. So if I wanted to do a circle, you can kind of see that the square does not rotate with my stroke, but I can choose to set an option where the alpha rotates along that stroke. So now if I were to make the same circle, the alpha is going to turn with the stroke. So play around with these, and you can dial in so many different unique brushes. I've been doing that myself, and I'm really enjoying this feature. It reminds me so much of Photoshop, and there's so much power behind it. If we switch to the Stencils panel, we can play around with some projections through transparencies. So let's clear this again. So we'll go to Eraser. I'm sorry, Fill by Eraser, and we'll again apply it to this level. And let's get a little closer. We can choose any stencil we want. You can create a library of stencils. Here we can grab something like this. It's a little easier to see what's happening. And we'll grab a pattern, something not crazy busy, maybe something like this as an example. And you can see when you're moving around, the pattern is moving with the camera, so your scale is really always going to be the same, but you can rotate. It's always projecting from camera. When you do choose a stencil, you're going to get this little window that pops up, and this is the control panel for your materials and stencils. And these have some really nice options. For example, I can decide to turn off tiling, and now I've only got one tile. This is really nice when you just want to use it as a decal. You'll notice there's a green dot in the middle of this tile. This green dot, if you right click on it, opens up some options. These options allow you to move the tile and place it. It allows you to scale the tile, rotate the tile, and move the tile, or move. This allows you to move where the pivot's going to be. So this, you can take this and I can set it to the corner. This is going to be my pivot. So now when I rotate, I can rotate along that pivot. Okay. And then you can also, if you click on these, you can scale your pattern along the X, along the Y, independently. And this one, of course, is a global scale. And then you can just hit the little X, and that will close your options. To reset it, you just click this reset, and everything will go back to its default settings. You can also choose whether your alpha is going to remain there or hide. So you have these options. So if I hover over the eye, it's going to show the full screen texture preview. So if I were to start painting on this, I'm just going to do it with color for right now. And I'm going to use just a regular brush for the stencil. And let's make this stencil a little smaller. So the controls that I showed you with this little green dot, the controls here, are also available here. Rotation, movement, scale, and squish and squash. and this will close this options window completely. So now that we have this, I can paint. Oops, let me go to the brush. Make sure I have a simple alpha. And now when I paint, I'm painting where the area is white. If I want to, but you notice that this image did not go away. If I change this to hide, then I don't see the print, but it's still there when I'm painting. Or I can set it to auto, so when I do start to paint, it goes away, so I can see exactly what I'm doing, and when I stop, it comes back on. And when I'm done, I can just hit the little X, and that ends that process. So here I was projecting through a camera, so let's do this again. Do it on this side. We'll grab a different pattern. Maybe we'll grab this pattern, and let's just make that smaller. Maybe something like that. And so now I can take advantage of a few of these really nice tools. So there's a warping tool, which just means that if I click that, it allows me to warp the image. So you can imagine if you were going to be projecting a face texture and you need to nudge some of the, if you have an eye that you want to project from a photo that doesn't quite fit the model, you can nudge that a little bit, and so you can make sure that everything is kind of fitting into place. You can even choose to tile. So now we have a repeated pattern, and now we can scale that pattern something smaller, and we can choose to either project from the camera. So you switch this to, so you can choose cube mapping, and you won't see the pattern displayed the way you did when we did project from camera, but instead what you will get is when you move your cursor over it, it's going to show you that pattern as you're, so I'm just hovering over and you can see the pattern. I can choose spherical map, which is using a spherical UV, and that's not really showing me anything. I can choose UV mapping, and when I start painting, it's just mapping to the UVs. In fact, if I switch to the UV editor, it's going to give you an idea of what I'm painting. So there it is here. But switching to cube map actually does let you see what it is you're painting. So I can take that and map it. And you're free to use a material for sure. So let's go ahead and drag my panel up a little bit and apply a material to that. So why don't we just create a new layer, and I can just delete this one. Okay, let's add a material. Add a fabric material. We can preview that material through this preview window. And you can see it's mixing between the stencils, and that's because I never closed the stencil option. So let's close the stencil option. Discard. Okay, now if I choose this pattern, you can see that pattern is applied directly in here. And you can see how the cube map is blending between the top plane and the side plane, because there's going to be a mix right in this area. So we can change the cube map to a camera projection and choose to tile it, and we're going to get this. Or we can choose the UV map, and that's going to give you an indication of how that's going to land on the UVs. We can still control the scale and the tiling through these controls here. We can move it around, and we can distort the texture in different directions. So you can see that. So now it's stretching in one way and it's stretching in another way. And we can reset back to the original. Okay, so now we can paint directly here. This is set to auto, which means that, so the reason that your pattern goes away when you hover inside this window is because it thinks that you want to paint something in this window. So you can do that. So we can change the size of the cursor or the brush. And if we like the way we have everything lined up, so maybe we'll just kind of bring the blue right to the edge in this area here. We'll rotate that a little bit around to us. Then I can actually take this brush and I can paint. And if I were to close this, my paint stroke is still there. It's really nice having that option, to be honest, because you can get an idea of like what material do you want to work with and actually see it applied to that model. So I can switch through to different materials, play around with their scale to see if there's something that's working or not working. Reset it, and I can change the scale. So that's how this preview works. It's super powerful. Again, now I can just paint over this. And another thing to note about this, the way your painting or your brush works is I'm going to go ahead and clear this really quick, add a new layer, I'll clear this layer. And let's go back to painting, but this time I'm going to close the preview window. I want to show you that when you're painting, you have two options for your brush. So you have connective picking and you have volume painting. So when you're working with meshes or surfaces, if you have it on volume-based painting, when you take the brush and you start painting, you can see that it's painting wherever that brush is hovering over. So if you have two meshes and your brush is crossing both, you're painting across both of those meshes. If I change this to connective picking, then the behavior is a little different. So the center of the brush has a little X marker. So if I click and that X is on one surface, I can get as close as I want to the edge of the other surface, and it's not going to paint. It's only going to stay within the model that I'm touching. In order to paint to the other model, I have to cross it. And now it's going to start painting along that model. This is one single model, so that's why it's across there. Another example is right here. This is really, really helpful when you're trying to work on the details of different pieces of the mesh, where you can't just paint in that little area because it's just too difficult and you got to zoom super, super close. This allows you to do that work much easier. You just click and start painting in a safe way. I can make this brush huge and it's still gonna paint only where I want it. So I can fill this area super quickly just by doing that without affecting anything else. It's an awesome feature. Okay, so next let's talk a little bit about the smart materials. So I'm going to go ahead and reset this object. We'll jump into the Paint UV Map Mesh per Pixel workflow. And this time we'll choose something that's got a little bit more shape and a little bit more complicated. So we'll grab this little robot guy. There we go. Let's zoom out a little bit. Close these windows and move this out of the way. Whenever you bring in a model from the preset models, from that main menu, many of them may already come with ambient occlusion and curvature, or in this case called a cavity mask, they may already be generated with those. But I'm going to go ahead and remove those so we can create our own. So we'll just delete those. And now we have just a standard model. Okay, the reason we want to create a curvature map is because the smart materials use that information to help create wear or grunge or a lot of these these details that you might want around like the wear and tear of a surface. So to create a curvature map, you just go to the textures section and choose calculate curvature. The default settings seem to work really well, so just hit OK. Depending on how complex your model is, these could take a little bit of time. Okay, so now we've got our curvature mask, and let's generate a ambient occlusion as well. Calculate occlusion. Stick with the default settings. All right, perfect. We can hide those layers and take a look at it without those. Now the curvature map will come already hidden, but that's okay because the smart materials will check to see if a curvature map has already been calculated. It doesn't have to be visible in your layers. It just needs to be calculated. And then the smart material will be able to use that curvature map to determine where the wear and tear or grunge might want to fit, depending on the setting you choose. Okay, but let's take a look at what that curvature map looks like. So there you go. Now the curvature map, you can see all the highlights around where the angles start to get a little sharper and where they're soft, it's a little broader. Okay, so let's go ahead and hide this. And what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and select a material. And now that we have a material highlighted, we can use this Smart Material Preview editor. So when we open this and we move it over a mesh, it'll actually render a preview of what that's going to look like. Okay, so you can move it around different areas. You can resize this window as well, so you can make it as big as you like, and you can get a good look at that model. What's nice about this is you can make some changes or settings to your smart material based on this preview. So let's go ahead and open this material by clicking on it again. And this is the Smart Material Editor. And you can see that this has multiple layers. We can hide each of those layers like this. We can also collapse those layers like so. So let's take a look at the copper layer and see what's going on there. So we have a texture plugged in, and if you hover over it, there's a preview of what that texture might be. And for the depth, there's a preview of the depth, and so on. Here's roughness. At any point, you can, let's enable this so we can see what this looks like. At any point, you can make some modifications to any of these by clicking on these icons, and you see that you've got color, depth, and glossiness, and those correlate with this as well, color, depth, and glossiness. So we can click any of these icons, and then it will give us a curve editor and the textured image that's being plugged in. So let's move the smart material out of the way. Let's just hit OK. We'll move this off to the side, and now let's look at this. If we move this curvature point, you can see that it's actually affecting the texture on the model in real time. And you can add more points anywhere along this curve. Now, by default, it's a spline curve, But if you right click on any of these points, you can change it from a spline to a linear curve, and if you click one more time, a Bezier curve. And click again, and we'll go back to spline. You can always reset the curve, and you can invert the image. You can even change the texture or the number of tiles or scale of the image through here, and you can see the effect of it. And you can even change the texture by selecting a new texture by clicking the Choose Texture dialog. We can even apply procedural noise to this to make some changes or even manipulate this texture. So for example, if I apply noise and I move the noise scale, you can start to see how we're starting to distort that image. And you can change how much distortion you want to apply to it. So we can minimize the amount, and then we can change the scale of the noise to distort. And of course, you have a seed. Do that. Oh, you can also apply a curve just for the noise. You'll have to switch to the Noise tab. And now, let me increase the scale a bit. And now we can create a curve for the noise, so we can make more exact changes. But then jumping back to the overall noise, which is for the color, that can be a whole different pattern. So we can do something like this, and we can jump to the noise and have something like that. So we'll just go ahead and reset curve. You can delete a point. When you hit reset curve, by the way, it's going to reset it for the color, but not the noise. For the noise, you can hover over any of these points and just hit delete. And when you're done, click done. But if you want to copy this, you can hit copy, and then you can go to another channel and you can paste it. All right, so the same goes for depth and roughness. You have all these different controls. Okay, so now we can start to talk a little bit more about some of these settings over here. So let's go ahead and we'll leave this one alone. We'll leave this one alone, and now let's enable this layer here. If we open this layer, we can, here, let me close this. If we open this layer, what we see is that there is a texture plugged into the degree. Now the degree is where the curvature comes into play. By default, this is set to always, which means that this is going to be applied over the entire model. Once we change this to one of these control functions, this is going to tell the material where it's going to mask. It's going to use this as a mask. So let's hide this copper layer, and let's take a look at layer 1. What you'll notice is that there's a map that's placed under the degree parameter, and this parameter is where the curvature map comes into play. So right now it's set to 0, and it's using a more concave setting. So if we zoom in to an area, something like this, where there's some concave features, let me make my brush smaller, concave features, as we start to bring this degree up, we should start to see, the degree, we should start to see those scratches coming in. And it's using this scratch map, and if we hover over it, that's what the map looks like. So scratches are being applied in the concave area. We can change that and we can say, you know what, apply it to the convex. And now the scratches are going to apply to the outer curved sections, like that. Okay, and now let's take a look at layer 2. We'll go ahead and hide layer 1. So what's layer 2 doing? Let's take a look. We'll open it up. Again, there's a metal 2 map. I believe this is the same as the color. But what's happening is you can see that they're using the moon, which if you were to look at it, is more in shadows. So when you see this icon, when you see the moon being used, that's basically saying take a look at the occlusion map, and based on the occlusion map, let's start to apply this texture to that. So the occlusion map becomes the mask. So let's find a place where occlusion is pretty heavy. Probably in here, right? So if I start to increase the degree, you can already see that the occlusion, like if you look in this area, it's starting to apply. Oh, here's better. This is a better area. We'll go over into something like this. And it starts to creep out from around the occlusion areas. So now if you look into these dark areas, we start to see the effect. We make this a little bit bigger too. Like so. You can see that the areas where a lot of light is hitting, you're not going to see so much of that effect. It's going to be more in the darker areas. All right, so this is just kind of an idea of how smart materials work, and that you have a lot of control in where you're placing this. We should take a look at another material that has a heavy influence in this. So maybe something like, let's see, something like this maybe. And if we open this material, we can start to see right away the influences are happening over here. So we can just take this layer 1 and start to pull the curvature. Either we increase it or we decrease it so it's just concentrated around the edges. Okay, and we can switch that to concave, and now we'll have the other side of it. So now we can control where this effect is coming in the concave areas of the model. Okay, we'll put that back. And again, using occlusion in different areas, so maybe this will have a better result. So let's take a look up in here where we know we have occlusion. And now if I start to dial this back, so you can see now as I start to increase it, it's really only affecting those areas where occlusion is present. But I can always push past it and it will start to apply to the entire model. So the occlusion, it's pretty subtle, but it's great for like adding dust and things like that in some of these areas. If you wanted to project this texture and paint through a projection camera, you can set this to from camera. And at that point, you see the screen turns into the projection mode like this. And for example, we can just go ahead and try painting. Oops, let me set that to brush. And then I can just paint these areas. We can change the tiling effect. Like so. Apply that here as well. and close. So with the smart materials, you can add as many layers as you like. You can also hide the layers like so. Oops. Like so. We will preview it. And you can even change the maps just by clicking on the map, and it'll go into your browser. Also, you can define what you want visible. So these are really only using the map for the degrees, but because there's values being plugged into depth, roughness, and metalness, it's nice to keep these available. But if you did not want things available, like for example, the depth is 0, metalness is 0. So you don't really need the depth and metalness. You can simply hide those, and you do that by clicking this down arrow, and then from here you can hide or make visible what parameters you want shown. So we don't need depth, and we don't need metalness, and that way you can trim down your material so it's not so big. When you have a multiple layered material like this, you may want to plug in a mask between these layers, and that's where you would use this contrast. Under the contrast area, you can plug in a mask or an opacity texture, and then that will flow through. And that way you can create these layers that are very specific in the defined areas of a material. Okay, so that is a quick look at the Smart Material Editor. Now let's move over to the layers section. Okay, so with the layers section, just like Photoshop, you have a layer, and everything you're painting while that layer is highlighted is automatically assigned to that layer. So let's go ahead and delete this layer and create a new one. Let's create a couple of layers. Actually, 3 layers. We'll call this layer bronze. We'll call this layer steel. And we'll call this layer we'll call this layer a mask. Okay, so we'll go to the bronze layer, and we'll go ahead and apply a bronze material. And let's get it looking okay. We'll just tighten it up a little bit, like so. And then we'll just apply this material to the entire layer. So we'll fill color to the layer. Hit OK. All right, so now we have the bronze material applied to the model. Now let's go to the steel layer, and let's pick a steel. Okay, let's go ahead and just pick this. And then let's go ahead and apply this material as well. We'll apply it to the steel layer. Great. So now we can close this. So now we have 2 materials. We have a steel material, and we have this bronze or copper material. What we're going to want to do is we're going to want to apply the steel in areas where we can define that with a mask. So the way we do that is we choose steel, and we tell the steel that we want to use a layer as the mask. So through the clip mask layer, it'll list all the layers that we have available. We'll just choose mask. And you can see that now all we see is the bronze material. By the way, you can invert that mask like that, And now when you when you use the mask, you're removing material, and then the bronze will come through. So any way you want to work, let's go ahead and do it this way. So right now we're looking at steel, but maybe we want some of these areas for the bronze. So now we can go to mask, and at this point we'll just disable the depth and the glossiness and just use a color for the mask. So let's say the fingers, we want those to be copper. So we can fill by just, we'll set it to color and we'll just click on the fingers. Like so. And if you want to see the result, we can either hide that mask, and now it's good, because what's happening right now when it's enabled is you're seeing that color, this color being filled in, which is just the mask color. We can just hide the mask and just continue to work like this. So I want to, well, actually it has to be enabled for you to fill. So if you want to see the result on the mask, we'll just set the opacity to 0. And now you're going to see the result of that. So let's go ahead and continue. We'll just go ahead and make these tips. There we go. And maybe this as well. And so you can see how quickly and easily you can start to reveal the different materials through the layers. If we went back to the steel layer and said, let's not invert that mask, then it's going to do actually the opposite. Now I'm defining through the mask where I want the steel bits. So maybe this and this, you know, things like that. So you can quickly start to define the different materials based on the layers that you have and the mask. So I could name this mask like mask underscore steel. You can create a group by clicking the group icon, and from there you can drag your mask in that group, and you can name the group masks underscore GRP. And now you might have a mask for steel, a mask, maybe there's some rubber bits and things like that. You can have all your masks in here. And so when you have layers, let's go ahead and add another layer. We'll call that rubber. And we'll go to the rubber section here, and let's apply one of these rubber materials. So let's go ahead and do this. So now we have a rubber material. And so let's add this to the layer. Like that. And depending on where it is in the structure, so we can take this layer and move it underneath the steel. And now the steel is on top like that. And we can create a mask under the groups, under the mask group, and call that mask rubber. And so we'll go to the rubber section and define which mask we're going to use. And we said mask rubber. And there we go. And so now I'll go to the mask area and I'll start applying where we want those to go. like that. Okay. And there you go. So now you have different materials being driven by the masks on this model. Okay, so now let's go back into our tools section in the paint room and see what else some of these tools are doing. So we worked with the brush, but let's try something like the coloring brush. So when I click on coloring, and I'm going to highlight the steel maybe. When we click on coloring, you'll see under the tool options, we have these choices. Actually, let's do the bronze in this case. We can then decide what we want to do, and we can desaturate this material. So now I've clicked desaturate, and maybe I want to desaturate this area. So now I can start painting with a desaturated brush. All right. And we can do other things as well. We can actually increase saturation or darken. Maybe we want to darken some of this. It's great for creating some kind of grunge. Here we go. Perfect. So this is kind of like a color correction brush, and you can apply color correction exactly where you want. All right, let's move on to height. Height is basically a brush that allows you to control the strength of the normal map or the displacement map. Let's try the steel. I think that has displacement on it. Yeah, so let's increase this effect, push that up to 100. And now you can start to see I'm actually increasing the effect of the normal map in these very specific areas. If ever you wanted to see what the normal map looks like, you can open up this window. This is the UV editor, and you can look at the wireframe, and you can look at the color. You can look at the normals, and there's an example of the normals right there. And you can look at the roughness and metalness. If you have multiple UV sets, if you click here, it'll list all your UV sets, which are your UDIMs, for example. It doesn't have to be UDIMs. You can have multiple UVs for the different object pieces, and that'll list here as well. There's a smudge tool, and this just allows you to change or kind of push around your texture. Right now I have a lot of strength applied to it, so it's really strong. But right now I'm applying it to all three channels of depth, color, and glossiness. I could just apply it to color only and then just start kind of moving. Well, this color is kind of like the same color. Let's apply it to the depth only. And then I can start pushing that around. Depending on what brush you want to use, these brushes have some behaviors to them. You can start smudging your paint. Okay. You have tools for cloning, so you can clone bits and pieces. You can copy and paste sections from your image. And then there's these curve effects. These are pretty interesting. So let's put a color in here, maybe red. Let's add a new layer. So I'll do this orange. and we'll add a new layer. And now I can use this curve, and depending on the size of the brush, it's going to define how big that curve is. So let's make that brush smaller, and we can start laying our curves down. And if we're happy, we'll just hit enter, and it basically took the brush that I have highlighted and applied it. It only applied it in the depth because I had color and glossiness turned off. So let's undo, let's enable those, and let's reapply it by hitting enter. And there you go. And we can hit escape, and that will turn it off. But it's really nice if you wanted to add accent pieces. So you can, again, let's just use a regular round brush, make something a little cleaner. Okay, so with the curves tool, we can just add the curves anywhere we want. So let's just start dropping some down. We'll grab a few, something like this. And let's make this spaced differently. We'll close it. So now we have this big gap and we've got these tighter sections. We can use some of these controls here. So we can say equalize, and that will resort these points to an equal distance apart from each other. If you want to change the size, you can hover over any of these and right click, and now you can increase and decrease the size of this curve based on these points. We can do something like this. If you're happy with what you got, you just hit enter. And then it's going to apply that to this layer that we've just added here. We can store the curve, and you can always restore it and use it at a later time or on a different surface. And we'll just go ahead and move on. So if you hit escape, it'll remove your curve. So now we can try text. Text works the same way. We can just start laying down our curve like so. And let's change the color of that. Make it black. So now we got some text like this. And we can reposition these points. We can change the scale. So you got something like that. And hit enter. And we've just applied some text. Picture is the same thing. It just allows you to put a decal. If you have a sticker that you want to put on the surface, you can use picture. And then, of course, hide lets you hide parts of your model just by painting it out like this, just in case you need to kind of isolate an area and there's too many things in your way. You can just kind of hide by paintbrush. If you hold Control, you just bring everything back, or you can use your fill tool. Actually, no, if you want to fill everything, you can change your brush type to a marquee select like this, zoom out, and then just apply. Well, now I'm just doing a hidden, but I'm also ignoring back faces. That's why everything didn't get hidden. I'll uncheck that so it doesn't ignore back faces. And now if I did this, I just hid the entire model. If I want to bring that model back, I can go under hide and unhide all, and it'll come back. If I want to hide just a section of it, I can use this marquee set selection tool, or I can even use this tool and say I want to hide this head section. And I'm hiding that. And now I can go in here and I can start working in detailing this area without the head being in the way. If I want to bring it back, just go to hide, unhide all, and there we go. I think these are pretty self-explanatory as you're going through and playing around with it, but there's a lot of really powerful tools here, and there's some really interesting brush options. So what we looked at was basically a non-pressure sensitive brush, meaning that even though I'm using a stylus, I'm not painting with any pressure sensitivity. But once I go into these that have the faded brushes, those are all pressure sensitive, and I can paint with pressure. We can also paint with stamps. So let's grab a brush alpha that looks like this, and we'll just go ahead and create a new layer, and I'll paint with a dark blue. And so what we'll do with this is it's kind of a stamp, so I can click on it and you can see that I can scale it and reduce the size of it and then drop it. And the depth is all based on how strong my the strength on the depth is on the brush. It's pretty high right there, so I'm probably going to want to reduce that down a little bit, and then I can apply it. Oops. And then I can apply it. There you go. There's also this is really interesting, there's this polygon tool right here. So if I click this, it'll only paint, and you see how it highlights the triangles, and if you have quads, it'll highlight the quads. It'll allow you just to paint in those areas. Oh, I guess it doesn't really look at your brush alpha. So if I wanted to apply to the polygon, I'm just going to click, and you can see it applies just to the polygons. It's a little harder to use when you're using triangles because it's not quite so clean, but if you have quads, it's a great way to outline just around the surface. So you can do something like that, go all the way around, based on a border of a mesh. Okay. I think that pretty much covers the tools and the features of just the paint room. We'll see you at the next video.